All right. So, ta-da, you're official. So do you want me to do a little bit of an introduction? So in honor of Black Bird this week, I'm Dr. Gillian Bowser from Colorado State University. I'm an associate professor. I actually study insects. And I'm going to ask Drew and Scott to introduce themselves. I'm also a board member for Hawk Mountain. Drew.
Well, I am Drew Lanham. I study bugs in as much as birds eat them.
Hey, wait a minute.
So I'm a conservation and cultural ornithologist at Clemson University, holding endowed chair. There have been a bird watcher slash birder slash bird adorer since about age 8. So doing the math, that makes a lot of time, almost a half century of following birds around. So happy to be here this morning and today to talk about sort of the wide span of what birding, bird watching, nature study, conservation, environmentalism can be if we're more inclusive and consider diversity in all the manifestations of both birds, beasts, and humanity.
Well, but before Scott can, before Scott jumps in, say, hey, Drew, we'll have to talk sometime about rescuing city pigeons and pigeon racing. That's really common in Brooklyn when I grew up.
Yep.
And rescued a lot of pigeons. I may have beat you out there in terms of, being 4 or 5, trying to rescue city pigeons and feed them worms and other such crazy things which I didn't actually like. And we had a lot in our backyard. So sorry, Scott, go ahead.
That's fine. I'm Scott Weidensaul, and I've been involved with Hawk Mountain since I was 12. My first trip to Hawk Mountain when I was 12, exactly 50 years ago this year. Got hooked on raptors, got hooked on migration, grew up almost in the shadow of Hawk Mountain. I've been on the board for many, many years, just stepped down as board chair. And it's been my very great pleasure and privilege to have taught on a number of occasions with Dr. Lanham up at Audubon's Hog Island camp on the coast of Maine, where I've been an instructor for about 22 years. I'm really hoping we get a chance to do that again pretty soon, Drew.
Absolutely, Scott.
Which island in Maine? By Acadia?
No, it's Hog Island is near Damariscotta. It's down on the mid coast. It's
Okay.
Audubon's oldest facility. It was founded in 1936.
I discovered photography at Freeport, Maine, in the Freeport, Maine Photographic Workshop, which is not that far, I don't think.
No, it's not. Only about an hour.
Yeah, amazing place. So part of this conversation is looking at, Black Birders Week and sort of sharing, and Drew, maybe go back to you to start a conversation. I think turkey and skinny legs and how you can't do much with turkeys and skinny legs. But, thinking about raptors and hawks and these are and migratory animals. So I study mostly insects, but these things actually move a lot more than we give them credit for. A bumblebee can move really far. A dragonfly can move about 26 miles in its normal range. So it moves quite a bit. And as those animals move, they cross boundaries and they cross cultures and they cross spaces. So when we go back and we look at how we conserve these things, we need to think about that space that they cross. So I wonder if you guys can maybe start a little bit, look at raptors and hawks, which are some of the longer range migrants in the world. And how do we look at that with a cultural lens beyond Black Birders Week? I mean, why is this important?
Well, for me, and again, thank you for having us here. And Scott's a great friend, and I've actually used Scott's writing in my class, and so he informs a lot of what I do. I think probably the raptor that I would call at least my hallmark raptor as a Southerner is a swallowtail kite, and swallowtail kites are wide-ranging species, but here, so you think about the way really into central South America, up through Central America, but the bird here that many people would consider sort of a southeastern bird is also wide-ranging, all the way up the Mississippi, Ohio River Valley drainage. Historically, I think there were maybe 5 birds in New York last year. So a bird that once it gets on the wind I think takes not just advantage of its evolutionary capacity to soar, but if you watch a swallowtail kite, it's easy to see joy in that flight. So when I think about swallowtail kites in the southeast, as they come, many of them up peninsular Florida and across the black belt of Alabama into the low country of South Carolina and Georgia. I think about those places that those birds fly over, and these shared ranges again, Gillian, that we talk about, and that these range maps, as we see them flat laid out in some publication, are really deceptively two-dimensional. But when we expand it, even through a GIS coverage, we only get so much. And conservationists have only been willing to look at so much. So, I have a mantra of same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. And all of those things are within range maps that swallowtail kites happen to cross. And maybe what I'll do as we go forward, I'll share a little piece with you that I wrote about swallowtail kites for the next book, because I think it gets at your issues. I think it gets at our issues. You think about Hawk Mountain. How many swallowtail kites, Scott, have been recorded at Hawk Mountain?
I would be hard pressed to say if there have been any. Mississippi kites, but
Yeah.
I don't know about swallowtail kites. But I mean, that's a species that used to breed as far north as Minnesota
Yeah.
back in the 19th century, and then there's this enormous range contraction. So I keep hoping and waiting for them to recolonize north and reoccupy the land that they occupied when that was indigenous land and not colonized land.
Yeah, it again is, I try to get into the minds of birds, which we can't do. I mean, the science gives us some information, a little bit of cause and effect, but mostly, we sort of tag along and then make guesses, hopefully informed guesses about the birds. But when I see a swallowtail kite, I'm imagining it, just a few days before, perhaps having looked down on the backs of jaguar or shared airspace with harpy eagles, but also having crossed political boundaries and cultural boundaries and walls that people build, that we can't do in the same way that kites do. So I think one way for me that I connect birds, not just raptors, but birds to people, is sort of trying to have this hawk's eye view, this kite's eye view, and it's aspirational. Birds are aspirational, and I think if we begin to rethink and sort of put our hearts not just back into watching birds, beyond listing them, but also our hearts, Scott, back into what I read when you write, and that the heart of your love for these birds comes through in all this science. And, and that's a critical thing to me.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, when you see a swallowtail kite, what does that mean to you? I mean, what's at the heart of the matter? What is a swallowtail kite to you?
Freedom and choice. A kite goes where a kite wants to go. Sometimes it goes where, the weather, the wind currents help to go. But I see that bird. You watch a kite fly over, a late summer field of hay, with these hatches of dragonflies and grasshoppers, Gillian, and these birds are doing things, sure, to capture food, but they're also just doing things because they can. And there's no restriction on what a swallowtail kite. I mean, you just watch it, and and you watch these flights of swallowtail kites and Mississippi kites, and it's an aerial ballet. I mean, they're arabesque and pirouettes and pas de deux and all of these things that these birds are doing. And you know, I find myself watching swallowtail kites, having to close my mouth, making sure I'm not ingesting dragonflies and grasshoppers, because I cannot watch that bird, Scott and Jillian, without wonder. I can't watch it without wonder. And you know, and to see it just barely flick that forked tail, um, and it takes it this way, or to tip a wing, or to watch one in a dive and to come out of that dive and wonder how many G's that bird is pulling out of that dive. And it comes out of that dive and into these split S's and these aerial acrobatics that humans think that fighter pilots probably think they invented, but they didn't. So that's what I see. I see freedom and I see choice that evolved over millions of years. That for any technology that we might have, we can't replicate that. So, but when I see them flying over these landscapes, the Black Belt of Alabama, the Low Country of South Carolina, the you know these many of these impoverished counties here in South Carolina, in Allendale is sort of where people go to see swallowtail kites, and it's one of the poorest counties in the U.S. And you know, I go there with high-end optics, and many others go there with high-end optics around our necks and over our shoulders that are worth more than the average annual income of the average citizen in Allendale. And we go there and we watch these kites. We take pictures, and we leave with good feelings, but we don't leave Allendale, South Carolina, any way to get better, any way for that predominantly black county to get better, any way for people not far from there to have potable water that the kites also need, right? To talk about land conservation, to talk about foodways, to talk about these connections that swallowtail kites make between Allendale and other places that are very far away. And so people in Allendale will tell you they feel isolated. But when I went there to this kite festival, there were half a dozen black women there at this festival. And that amazed me in the first place. It's a very small festival that meets in a visitor center. And so people are just seated around tables, and here are these 6 black women over on the side, and I walk in and I'm like, wow. Because I mean, you go to bird festivals, you don't see very many black people usually. And so I go over and I talk to them, and it turns out that they are the art commission for Allendale. And we're talking, and they said, well, you know, we've heard about the kite festival. There's a kite on our logo. We thought it would be good for us to understand what the big deal is about this bird. So we take these vans out, and we find the field of kites. We found black-bellied whistling ducks first at a feed lot, all perched on a on a water trough, which was interesting, which they found interesting. But then the real target of that day were these kites, and so we finally found the field, and my count ended at about 15, 16 swallowtail kites and almost 40 Mississippi kites. And as they're watching this bird, I have a picture of one of these women with her AKA, her pink and green umbrella. Nobody had binoculars, and so I was loaning them my binoculars. Other birders were loaning them their binoculars. But eventually, I told them, I said, you know, you really don't need the binoculars for these birds. Yeah. Just watch. And they couldn't take their eyes off of them. And and watching that and standing back and watching these Black women watch and wonder over these birds was an experience in all of my years, Scott and Gillian, that I'd never had. And so, you know, when I say freedom and choice, you know, I think for anyone who watches those birds, who sees a swallowtail kite, if you take just a minute to watch it, it does. I mean, and kites are aerobatic, they're acrobatic, they're aerobatic. You know, we think of falcons and what falcons can do and other raptors can do, and I call falcons athletes, right? Falcons are athletic, but my God, it seems to me that a swallowtail kite was born defining flight. So defining flight. So watching these women and talking to them, they understood. And this was pre-COVID, and we had talked about getting together to try to understand how their county can get better under the wings of swallowtail kites. You know how, because the thing is, they're watching them in fields. They don't even know the owners of these fields. What if the owners of these fields, and there's a high likelihood that the owners of some of these crop fields are Black? Is there a way for those landowners to benefit? Right? Is there a way for the conservancy, the land trust that helps sponsor the festival, to say, you know what, we want to put something back in Allendale? Because part of their concern, these women, they said, you know, part of our concern is that we're ignored. You know, the downtown, so much of it is boarded up. Allendale, there's nothing but bad news that comes out of Allendale until these kites arrive, and then people want to go there. But there's hardly any place to eat there. And so just thinking about swallowtail kites and that connection to this place, because all up and down the I-95 corridor, which famously or infamously became the corridor of shame, known as the corridor of shame, it's third world in many of these places. But you not only have opportunities to see swallowtail kites there, you have opportunities to see red cockaded woodpeckers and pinewood sparrow and black rails there, and wood storks, and increasingly rare bobwhite quail. All of these things that you can see along this relatively impoverished sector of the South, and into the Black Belt down in Alabama, speaks to the important linkages between Black people and birds.
So, Drew, we were talking before we started recording here about how the ichthyology community, the fisheries community, has done a much better job at reaching out to Black communities, in part because, you know, so many Black people fish. There's a connection there. You know, there isn't historically that connection with birds and birding. You know, Black Birders Week is one step in that direction, but you know, it can't be just a one-off, 1 week a year thing. It's got to be pervasive. It's got to be all-encompassing. How else, for a conservation organization like Hawk Mountain, that has historically been 99 point, however many nines you want to add it, white, but very close to Hispanic communities, very close to African American communities, and some of the neighboring cities. How can an organization like Hawk Mountain do a better job of reaching out and being welcoming?
You know, I think again, it's expanding the range of Hawk Mountain, its mission, right? And so people think of Hawk Mountain, and we think of many as islands, as insular, and part of our problem, I think, as a conservation community, is that because we have conservation, these reserves that have been set aside, that's where wildness resides. You know, these are the important places. They're obviously important. Hawk Mountain's obviously important for hawk migration. to expand beyond that, so people understand with some of the science even. So, if there's a broadie that's been captured and tagged at Hawk Mountain or identified by Modus as or some other technology is coming through, where else is it going?
Right.
Who else is Hawk Mountain sharing that bird with? And rather, how is that bird sharing itself? I think empowering the birds, right, and sort of decoupling them from our purposes helps. I mean, metaphorically, it helps for people to understand that freedom and choice is a part of life, should be a part of life in many aspects. And so, as that bird goes away from Hawk Mountain, where are all the places that it flies over and sort of shares its underbelly with the world, that, some black or brown kid or some impoverished kid in Appalachia, right? Who might not have much hope of ever getting out of a particular holler and making their lives better and making their communities' lives better, to look up at that bird and have aspiration. I think Hawk Mountain can expand itself beyond that. We have to expand ourselves beyond park model. I mean, we talk, okay, well, let's, if we go to whatever national park, then we can see true wildness. And then when we leave it, we leave nature behind and maybe our dollars. So Hawk Mountain is bigger than Hawk Mountain.
Right. Yeah, because those birds are carrying that wildness and that wilderness across every backyard in the United States and Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras. I mean, as you're talking here, I'm remembering in 1992 when I was part of the first team from Hawk Mountain and Hawkwatch International in Pronotora, Veracruz, that was doing the count at Veracruz, Mexico, the big migration count, and we were on the soccer field in the little village of Chichicaxtli, which was long before there was a visitor center, long before there was a bird observatory. And the kids on recess and after school would come out and join us and watch swallowtail kites and Mississippi kites and broadwing hawks coming from the Northeast and Swainson's hawks coming from the prairies, and and heading to Ecuador, Bolivia, and who knows where else. And there was this little kid that was lecturing us one day that these are not your birds, senor, and these are not our birds. These birds belong to everybody. And the kid was like 8. It was an extraordinary moment that, even an 8-year-old kid in a Mexican village who's never, who's aware of these birds, but never really paid close attention until he started hanging out with these Mexican biologists like Ernesto Ruelas and learning about them. And that kid instantly recognized that these are creatures without boundaries, and connecting all of us. And so, trying to figure out ways to spread that message is, it's something that Hawk Mountain's tried to do for a long time. We've had an international traineeship program that's been going on since the 1970s. We've brought more than 500 trainees from 76 countries around the world, particularly Latin America and particularly Africa. But as Gillian pointed out when we were speaking earlier, our domestic education trainees have for the most part been white Americans and white Canadians. There's been far less of an effort on our part to reach out to black and brown North Americans, in the conservation education community. That's a place where we need to do dramatically better. But you're right. I mean, the opportunity for birds to connect people is about as evident as could possibly be.
I wonder maybe if you guys. Oops, sorry, Drew.
Well, I was going to say, Dr. Bowser, I think about, again, swallowtail kites down there in Allendale, and there's USC Salkehatchie, which is a branch of the University of South Carolina. So it's not a historically black school, but there's a large enrollment there. But then right up the road, you have South Carolina State University, which is a historically black college. You've got Claflin College, Claflin University, which is a historically black college. To begin, and Dr. Rashida Fareed at Tuskegee now has the George Washington Carver Bird Club there. you've got other historically black colleges that are within the range that these birds cross over. So one of the things that I would suggest is to begin to seek out some of these partnerships. I've argued that the large conservation organizations in this country that are sitting on resources, right? And when I say sitting on resources, people, around a board table that have more money in their right pocket than I will ever see in 3 lifetimes. How there are not endowed fellowships and scholarships connected to historically black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges, how that money has not flowed that way astounds me. Because it's a pretty easy get, right? To say, well, look, we're going to sponsor 3 fellowships to go to Hawk Mountain just to visit, or we're gonna sponsor travel assistantships for students to go to bird festivals. Because one of the things that came up during Black Birders Week last year on the panel that I was on was how many of these young people, none of them, with the exception of one, had been to a bird festival. And you ask them why, and cost was the first issue, right? And then there was discomfort with sort of suddenly being thrust into throngs of bird-brained, sometimes bird-crazy folks. But there's a way to go at some of these issues, I think, Scott and Gillian, and we can get at this in some very direct ways. So one of the things that I want to do, and maybe this is the place to do it, and not just challenge Hawk Mountain, but to challenge these other organizations, these large national, international organizations, to put their money where their mouths are, and to begin to not look for the freebie. And not look for the endpoint, because this is an endpoint. You're not going to suddenly have enough. And so you have to see it as an evolution. I was entertaining an email from a meteorologist yesterday who wanted to talk about migration. And she said, well, is it over? And I said, well, migration's never over. It just cycles through. And so, but she, I was getting that she didn't really want that answer, right? She wanted to linearize this. You can't linearize inclusion. You can't linearize diversity. You really have to think about this as a part of what's happening now. We're learning is that as people begin to identify in different ways, we have to then shift our thought process to understand that. And so I think one of the problems, Scott, is that, we see it as sort of this, we've got a problem, yes. What's the solution? What does that look like? And really, we have to get comfortable with first discomfort in addressing these issues. And I applaud Hawk Mountain for doing this, because if you don't address these issues, if you don't find yourself somehow in discomfort, then you're going to stay where you are. And if you stay where you are going to be sort of, homogenized. So, in order to get more colorful, you've got to think about the process. And again, I brought up the fish folks. It comes down to sometimes to tangible results. What you can pull from the water. Yeah, later on you learn sometimes I just want to wet a hook, right? But I go back to those women and I think about the woman with the umbrella just watching through her big fashion sunglasses, right? They didn't have on expensive outdoor wear. You know, it was none of that. And I looked down the line and I'm like, okay, so how do we become more inclusive? And that's one way we began to decouple what this is, right? You know, I grew up with Jane Hathaway helmet. And
Yeah.
no, well, I mean, I don't know. That was how that's what bird watchers look like, right?
Nerdy people wearing pith helmets.
Yes, nerdy people wearing
Nerdy
pith
white
helmets.
people wearing pith helmets.
Yeah, nerdy white people in Beverly Hills wearing pith helmets.
Yeah, and lots of
You know,
pockets, you know, all
and lots of and
pockets.
lots of pockets, lots of pockets, right? You know, there. So, you know, I look at people who are changing the game, you know, and I talk about white folks who are changing the game, and what they're doing. And one of those people, I talk about Paul Riss. Scott, you know
Yep,
Paul.
I
He's the
sure do.
punk rocker, and you know, with lifeless tattooed on his body, Canadian. You know, I think about Ken and Kim Kaufman, Kimberly Kaufman, and the stuff they do at Black Swamp Bird Observatory, and really moving outside of that bird observatory to bring kids in from Toledo and all across Ohio to the Great Black Swamp. You know, so those are things, those are exemplars. You know, Scott, I think about Project Snow and being out, and I tell this story of being out on Assateague with this group at the time that was called Coastal Stewards, and the woman who was running that program was named Carrie Samus, and these were brown kids who many of whose parents their parents' bird story was that they were at chicken processing facilities, you know, killing tens of thousands of chickens a day, but here their children only lived, you know, a very short crow's flight, really fish crow's flight, maybe from Assateague National Seashore. Well, here we are in February of 2013, and you know, there's this eruption of snowy owls, and we're on Assateague, this cold, blustery day, the kind of day only sea ducks and snowy owls love. And not one, not two, not three, not four, but five snowy owls. And all of these young people, black and brown people, saw these snowy owls, and suddenly their world was not just the eastern shore of Maryland or Berlin. Suddenly their world expanded to the Arctic and anywhere that a snowy owl could be. And that was a terrible thing to me. But what Carrie did in that instance was that she had stepped outside of her comfort zone as a middle class woman, to facilitate, not take people only where she wanted them to go, but give them to help them find meaningful experiences. So, you know, they didn't have them picking up trash as if they were convicts. These students actually worked with birds, you know, in a directed way, but had exposure to capturing and banding pelicans and other seabirds. So, you know, that kind of experience, you know, find those people. Find those people. I would encourage folks to find those kinds of folks to put on your boards. You know, I know there's always the give on a board, on many of these boards. I can't afford to give what people, you know, afford to give, and I have a pretty good job or what they ask. Look at the different kind of give.
Right.
Look at the talent give. You know, again, those are the things that are out there that you can do. You know, somebody for somebody could draft before we're finished with this conversation, they could have a plan for a fellowship for some historically Black college or colleges, to at least begin to begin the conversation, right?
I really like that idea, Drew.
Well, let me know how I can help. Part of what Gillian and Scott, part of what I wanted to do by getting off of boards was to sort of free myself up to speak more honestly without caveat, but also to help in a way that gives me the most freedom and the most choice. Again,
just like a swallowtail kite.
That's interesting. That's interesting, Drew, that you talk about the board as something that restricts your choice. And maybe it's because I'm from Brooklyn. I never quite figured out that I should maybe be more tactful on board rather than doing the usual Brooklyn of telling them like it is. But I'm loving these stories, and I think it's interesting to maybe segue back a little bit to the importance of these stories. And Drew, I just so struck. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I can remember and the snowy owl story is so amazing because I think that project did such a great job of connecting things. But you think about boards and you think about this idea of scholarships and structures, and a lot of what we do with bugs, which is actually pretty easy because there are a lot of them and you don't run out of them, is naming a team something actually adds a lot of power to getting people involved and excited. So we run what's called the Pollinator Hotshots, which is a group of students that run around and chase bugs. And they're not all pollinators, but that doesn't really matter. The idea is to get them excited about this identity. So I could even see like a Swallowtail Kite team. That's a series of scholarships that are scattered out along the range of the Swallowtail Kite. And part of what you're doing is you're trying to engage those students, not just as individual scholars, but as a team to ask that question across that bird's migratory range. And just by doing that, you will by default cross so many different cultures and get so many different people involved. And I think back, the other thing on bird festivals, out here in Colorado, we have the Sandhill Crane Festival. I'm sure you guys have been to it in Montrose, Colorado. That's amazing.
No, not that one. No.
Haven't been to that one either.
Oh, that's an amazing. Oh, you guys got to go. So
is that an invitation?
You bet. We'll happily drag you a whole pile of students down there with you. Because a part of what happens in the Sandhill Cranes Bird Festival is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has worked with the local community, which is a lot of Hispanic farmers, to leave their fields fallow during the migratory period, so the sandhill cranes can go on there. So the best sandhill cranes, like you were talking about, are by the cattle feedlot, or you just get thousands of birds that pass through there. So one quick story is we had a bunch of Hispanic students that we took down there as part of a project, and we're trying to figure out if visitors disturb the crane behavior. So we get there really early, notice the orientation of the cranes, and then watch as different visitors came in to see how the birds would reorient and if they would move away or they'd move toward. And of course, as you know, some things disturb birds more than others. But one magical moment, a bus pulled up, and there's a bunch of Hispanic kids plus us and a very diverse group. And we're just talking, telling them what we're doing and what's happening. And two of the sandhill cranes start to dance in the background. So the kids started to dance, do that little crane dance. And wouldn't you know it, all the cranes started to dance. It was this magical, unbelievable moment.
Tell me somebody got this on. Did somebody get this on?
We have pictures. We didn't
film?
get the video. Yes, we got the pictures. It was amazing. It was unreal. And so the kids are dancing, the cranes are dancing. It was beautiful. But that's like that magic moment. Unfortunately, I don't think the video came out. We got a good picture of everybody with their wings up, But
wow.
Those type of magical moments change people's lives, and they change students' lives. And I think Hawk Mountain is in a position to talk about just following that sandhill crane, which doesn't occur for you guys, but that migration, just change. Those kids will never forget that experience.
That's right.
It took 2 minutes, 3 minutes of dancing.
And we've got 80 years worth of similar kinds of stories of people being touched by raptors at North Lookout on Hawk Mountain. The difference is they've almost all been white people. And so making that, a more egalitarian experience to get more people up on the lookout on a fall day to watch a golden eagle emerge out of a snow squall with low late day light glinting off its golden hackles, or like me as a 12-year-old sitting at the base of the owl pole watching a sharp-shinned hawk diving at the owl but looking like it's coming straight at me and being electrified, and 50 years later that shock still running through my body. Making those kinds of experiences available for everybody is what we need to be trying to do.
But it's more than just making them available. I think it's linking that experience. So that same red-tailed hawk could have landed in Central Park.
Sure. Yep.
And do we then invite the people in Central Park to be part of that story? Do we share those stories
Sure.
in that context? And I can remember, we're busy telling stories, being in Washington, D.C. on the National Park Services building, which is just a big, ugly building, Washington, D.C., and our offices are on the 12th floor. And a peregrine falcon lands on our, balcony with this massive DC rat it had managed to pull out of somewhere. And the funny part, so all of us are busy watching this, like, wow, this is super cool. Look at this. It's sitting right there. And it manages to drop the rat's head on the pavement below. So it's looking down like, dang, that's the best part. But, there are all these janitors and we're all watching this hawk, and you go out for lunch and there's that rat head sitting in the middle of the street and all these people looking down like, where did that come from? But so I think that same hawk probably went through Hawk Mountain.
Sure.
Or could have passed through that area.
And through Mexico, and
exactly.
all the way down to the Pampas of Argentina, or the Altiplano. That's what birds do. They connect the world. They draw all those disparate places together in a single unified whole. And
so maybe that's our task, Scott, is that connection.
Yeah.
To think about, can we create a series of scholarships like Jewish Adjusting? Students, unfortunately, are pretty cheap. You could pay a student a summer salary for what, $5,000 bucks? When you look at people like Gates and everybody else, you're not talking a lot of money to say, let's have some students, and their job is to connect these stories. You'll probably find there are a lot of stories everywhere.
Well, it's, that's part of the fun of it. We have, and as we keep collecting the data through science and through rigorous science, which is critical, that you then look at the creative aspects. You look at involving not just STEM, but I learned this after a conversation with some friends in Cleveland last week, of STREAM: science, technology, recreation, engineering, art, and math. And so those students who are dancing are no less important than the engineers developing the nanotechnology, in some sense, that we begin to see a stream as the important continuum to connect, that people need to be able to tell these stories scientifically, but then we've got to be able to take 900 pages of climate change data into 280 characters on a text or a tweet, right? Because we learned, a couple of years ago that tweets can run the world. And so that's one of the last questions I ask my graduate students before they finish. They're experts in everything. They've done all this work, and I'm always amazed that word hasn't gotten around. And I'll ask them the last question before we send them out of the room to deliberate their fate. I'll say, okay, you've done all this work. I'm going to give you 1 minute to tweet out what you learned. And they sit there and they waste 30 seconds because they can't get their heads around, oh, you mean take 300 pages of my life and down to 2? I said, you can use a picture, sure. And how many of them have not taken a photo of a sunrise or a sunset or the beautiful places that they've toiled, and that they have not come to this place of being able to translate the science to go from here to here. And my firm belief is that the only way we get to here is through here.
Yeah.
Um,
And raptors are really good at getting you here.
Here. And Scott, when what you just described of that golden eagle coming out of that snowbank, and we've seen, you know, those of us who've been fortunate enough to see that eagle, that golden eagle turn just so, and it's like an explosion of spangles off of its, and you never forget that moment.
Yep.
But we, you know, that's you know, these connections, these linkages, Jillian, that you're talking about. They're there to be had. We just have to move beyond where we are as a community to say, you know what, we're going to do things differently. And we're going to take some risks where other, you know, conservation for some reason has been conservative, but conservation doesn't mean conservative, right? And so for us to begin to get outside of these boxes, I think will give us some moves. And quite frankly, I see a place like Hawk Mountain is better able to do it because it's smaller, it's more nimble, and less, and I would guess less risk averse. I can tell you again, you know, that big ships, it takes a long time to turn them around.
Yep.
There's a lot of momentum there, and there's a lot of risk, you know, to shove it, you know, that rudder the other way. Smaller organizations have the capacity, I think, to show the larger organizations the way. And I think Hawk Mountain can do that.
Well, and Hawk Mountain's history is that. I mean, it was founded in 1934 by a woman who was frustrated by the lack of concern on the part of the large conservation organizations like Audubon for birds of prey. And so Rosalie Edge said, well, damn it, then we'll just buy the top of the mountain where this shooting is taking place, and we'll protect those hawks, and we'll make it a sanctuary. You know, she was just, you know, she was a, you know, she'd learned activism in the trenches of the women's suffrage movement. You know, and she was described as a hellcat for conservation, and we've still got, I hope, a little bit of that DNA in us. So
there you go.
And maybe part of your. Oh, sorry.
I mean, again, that's the, you know, that's the critical thing. I mean, that's, you know, and now is the time. I mean, look, when people talk about conservation heroes, yeah, how out of 10 birders who should know, how many know who Rosalie Edge was?
Yeah, very few.
3. And so the stories of different people who've done this and have taken risks, you know, again, you know, those are the stories that need to be told, and suddenly you begin to get different traction, right? You begin to get a different kind of traction, you know, and the last story I suppose I'll tell in our time is this recent scientific paper. I cannot remember the authors to save my life, but you know, the work that was done looking at who's publishing the science on birdsong. Right.
Female birds versus male birds. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing.
That's a matter of perspective, right? That, you know, the old story is, well, male birds are the predominant singers, and, you know, and well, where are the studies being conducted, and who's conducting these studies? How are people watching? How are people listening? And it turns out that who does the work matters. And so, you know, I trot that paper out when someone asks, well, why does diversity matter? Here you go.
Yep.
You know,
you know, we overlooked the ornithological community overlooked the fact that female birds sing commonly, abundantly, widespread, and we'd overlooked that for like 300 years.
Yes.
Because the guys
but at the same time, we've overlooked that birds occur in urban spaces.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You think about it. We don't talk about urban birds the same way we talk about wild birds, but it's the same bird.
Yep.
You know, it's the same bird crossing back and forth. I love like cardinals and, you know, crazy little guys like that I mean, they exist everywhere, and we don't talk about that as a connector.
Right.
But before we, sort of run out of our time, Drew, I know we're going a little bit over, but you suggested maybe you'd be willing to share one of your stories that you've been working on, and that would be an awesome way to think up. And while you wrap that together, I wanted to share that what I'm hearing from this conversation is that maybe our next risky step is let's support some people to do something different. Let's build some stories on these different audiences. We could do something simple, like take a range map, a piece of art, and just connect all the dots underneath that range map and say, okay, Calvin College, you are here. And Drew, I had 3 students from Calvin who are on my Pollinator Hotshot crew. So they were awesome, amazing students, so just connecting those dots, Spelman College, that those hawks are all passing over, and say, can we support one student intern at each of those locations? And it can even be a virtual intern. Find out the data, find out the stories, get the art and the STEAM part involved. What is that connection with that falcon? What is that connection with that kite? What happened with those ladies that Drew told about? Is there now art that reflects that logo that they have if they hadn't seen the kite itself? And that's an amazing story when you think about it. I think about my relatives. My auntie's famous saying is that she likes concrete. There's nothing wrong with concrete. It's pretty good stuff. So why step off of it? But she defines her spirit animal as the cardinal. So it's not interesting. So she's got cardinal everything all over her house. You name it, it's got a cardinal on it. So she's connecting with this bird, but she's not interested in the wilderness spaces. These are the people we need to reach, that they can connect with that same bird as it passes on its journey back and forth. And this is something, like, again, when we talked about our pollinator work, the idea is the pollinators connect with our food are in our backyard. All these things are connected. Right. It doesn't matter that your community garden is in the middle of Pittsburgh. It's the same pollinators. Every pumpkin you eat has a bee associated with it. That's right. Every tomato you eat has a bee associated with it. And those bees cross all these boundaries. And we can tell that story of the Cherokee black tomato to the Krim tomato. I mean, it just goes across, the spectrum to the Native American connections. And that's what we need to do. I think that's what Hawk Mountain has the opportunity to do, but haven't done it. Cool. So that would be my challenge. How do we do it? How do we get these kids from all over? So Drew, I want to turn it back to you. And sorry, Scott, you want to say something?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, I didn't have anything.
I'm just going to share this it's a relatively short piece, and this is a chapter from the book that I'm currently working on. And this is the chapter on Swallowtail Kite, which right now is entitled Swallowtail Kite, Wings and Wildness on the Outer Edges of Marginalization. And the epigraph is, if you surrendered to the air, you could ride it. Toni Morrison.
Wow.
So then, if wildness is in a raptor's flight, then its epitome, its ultimate expression, comes through kites. They are not the fastest or most powerful or most enduring, but they fly with an ethereal grace other raptors must envy. But even among the kites living on every continent except Antarctica, the ultimate enviable expression vaults to near worshipable in the Western Hemisphere's Eleonoides fortificus, the American swallow-tailed kite. Watch a swallow-tailed kite soaring high above the darkly winding Blackwater Edisto River in the sweltering humidity of a South Carolina low-country sky, and you may almost forget your heat-riven, mosquito-bitten misery. Bites, stings, and sweat will fail to distract if a swallow-tailed kite suddenly and silently appears from the heavenly ethereum, as they often do. Watch skyward with eyes unwilling to blink for fear of missing an aerial arabesque or pirouette while the bird catches breezes we will never feel. Watch slack-jawed and chest-thumping as it floats like feathered dandelion fluff on a warm southwest wind against the building wall of sullen gray storm-swollen clouds. Watch and know in the absorbing of it that it is a bird built on effortlessness, Watch and adore the almost 4-foot wings of an adult that are pointed like a falcon's knife-edged flying tools, but longer and broader as they shoulder into a steely plumbeous back. The bird's smallish white head with a gentler than should be killer's eye that can detect the movement of a shimmering emerald June bug from 1,000 feet will swivel to watch you. Kites are inquisitive creatures. Its cotton camouflage, belly and wing linings, the inner surfaces, are all starkly white as the clouds it courses through. The white on white of sky against Swallowtail Kite underside. You must look intensely at first to find it, but once you do, your gaze will become fixed and stupefied, as if its beauty had turned you to stone. In this fixed state of amazement, you will notice that the remainder of the wings, all of the flight feathers, and the namesake scissor tail are black as double-burned coal soot. At times, there is an almost iridescent sheen given to a blackness that is so black that all other hues are sucked into it. The totality of body and wings of black and white and gray is the swallow-tailed kite's plumage. It is a simple palette, but the bird paints itself more brilliantly than a kaleidoscope and unpredictable strokes in air artistry against southern summer skies. It is an unmissable and unmistakable bird. The appearance of a single swallowtail kite is startling. The gathering of a small squadron arrests the heart. One risks vicarious ascendance in the witnessing. I thank whatever gods evolved such a mythical beast each time I'm blessed to be in its presence. I find it nearly impossible to keep joyful tears from falling into the corners of my gleeful smiles when I'm in witness of a flying swallow-tailed kite. I would gladly kneel in reverence to their divinity before I would stand in allegiance for any flag. So that's what I think of swallowtail kite.
Tell us how you really feel, Drew.
It's a draft, but so
it's beautiful.
That's a lovely way to sort of think about, how to close out our discussion on Black birders is that wonder, providing that wonder, those stories for everybody that is so important and so amazing. It can't be just a week of thinking about it. It's got to be a lifetime of effort. And I think, sort of the things that we've shared this morning, and thank you both for all this time. And, poor Jamie's got to figure out how to chop down this 10-minute conversation.
Right.
But we had way too much fun. Clearly, we need to do this again. It's, maybe a storytelling hour is what we really need to think about, is how we tell stories from different perspectives, how we share that to inspire people to think about birds and other things that are emblematic of all of our cultures. They pass through all of our cultures. They appear in all of our cultures, whether you grew up with the pigeons of New York City or swallowtail kites or cardinals or whatever it is, how do those tie together? So I wonder, maybe Scott, if you want to do some sort of last, thoughtful comments or stories or pontification.
I really don't have anything that can top what Drew just said. I would like Drew's words to serve as the benediction on this. So leave it at that. Thank you, Gillian, for putting this together. Drew, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to see you, my friend. Hopefully,
Scott, you're my brother in birds. And I love the work that you do. Always have, always will. And thank you, Gillian, for putting this together. Thank you, Hog Mountain, really, for taking some chances. That's the only way we move forward. So I'm happy to be a part. And I'm looking forward to working with Hawk Mountain into the future.
Thank you both. And I guess we do have a challenge on the table to get you guys out dancing with the Sandhill Cranes in Montrose, Colorado. So practice your dance moves because they're pretty darn good dancers. So so thanks to all. And yeah, let's do this again. Maybe some conversations that we can inspire some changes through stories, through STEAM, through art, through music, through storytelling. And I guess the closing thought is there's nothing like a Sandhill Crane song in the early morning with the mountains behind it.
No doubt about that.
Yeah. So So
Take
thank
care.
you all. You take care and have an awesome day.
Right.
All right,
Okay.
you too.
Bye bye.
Take care. Ciao, ciao.